On the bitter February morning in 1987, the snow fell heavy over the riverside neighborhood of Portland, Oregon, blanketing the modest craftsman houses and chain-link fences in pristine white that would soon be stained red. Margaret Bennett stood at her kitchen window, watching her breath fog the glass as she waited for the coffee to brew. At 43, she had the weathered hands of a woman who'd spent decades cleaning other people's houses, but her eyes still held the fire that had attracted Tommy Bennett 25 years earlier when they were both teenagers working the night shift at the Blitz Weinhard Brewery. The Bennett family had lived on Southeast Morrison Street for 18 years, in a two-story house with peeling blue paint and a front porch that sagged just enough to catch rainwater. Tommy worked construction when his back allowed it, which was less and less these days. Their eldest son, Michael, 22, had just returned from 2 years in the army with a Purple Heart and a limp that reminded everyone of the roadside bomb outside Beirut. Danny, 19, worked nights stocking shelves at the Safeway on Powell Boulevard, saving money for community college. The youngest, Patrick, was 17 and spent most of his time rebuilding motorcycle engines in the garage, much to Margaret's dismay. What Margaret didn't know that February morning was that her husband Tommy had been meeting Sofia Cordova twice a week for the past 6 months in a room above Dante's Tavern on Southeast Division. Sofia was the 38-year-old wife of Victor Cordova, a man whose legitimate businesses included 3 restaurants and a trucking company, but whose real income came from moving cocaine up the Interstate 5 corridor from Los Angeles to Seattle. The Cordova organization wasn't the largest criminal enterprise in Portland, but it was certainly the most violent, with a reputation for settling disputes with gasoline and matches. At 7 minutes past 10 that morning, Margaret was folding laundry in the basement when she heard the front door slam with unusual force. Heavy footsteps moved across the floor above her head, followed by muffled voices she didn't recognize. She climbed the narrow stairs slowly, pressing her ear to the door at the top. Through the thin wood, she could hear her husband's voice, tight with fear, and at least 3 other men speaking in rapid Spanish. Tommy Bennett had been caught. Victor Cordova's nephew, Luis, had followed Sofia to their weekly rendezvous and watched through the window as she unbuttoned Tommy's work shirt, her wedding ring catching the afternoon light. Luis had taken photographs with a camera equipped with a telephoto lens, and now Victor knew everything. But Victor Cordova wasn't interested in a simple beating or a threat. In his world, disrespect demanded a response that would be remembered by everyone who might consider crossing him in the future. The 3 men in Margaret's living room were part of Cordova's enforcement crew. Jesus Morales, a thin man with prison tattoos covering his neck, did most of the talking while his partners, Ramon Velázquez and Hector Santos, stood by the windows watching the street. They had come to deliver an ultimatum. Tommy would bring his entire family to the warehouse on Southeast McLaughlin Boulevard at midnight, where Victor would personally oversee their execution as a lesson to anyone else who might consider touching what belonged to him. Margaret pressed her face against the basement door and heard every word. When Jesus Morales described exactly what they planned to do to her and her sons before killing them, she felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. This wasn't panic or fear, it was calculation. She had grown up in this neighborhood when it was still mostly Irish longshoremen and their families, back when settling disputes with violence wasn't uncommon and everyone understood that sometimes you fought or you died. The men left at 10:47 a.m., giving Tommy 12 hours to arrange his family's execution. Margaret waited until she heard his truck start in the driveway before she came upstairs. She found Tommy sitting at the kitchen table, his head in his hands, shaking like a man with fever. When he looked up and saw her face, he knew she had heard everything. For the next 4 hours, Margaret listened as Tommy confessed to his affair with Sofia Cordova, explaining between sobs how it had started innocently enough with conversations at the grocery store where Sophia shopped, how she had seemed so lonely and unhappy, how one thing had led to another. He begged Margaret's forgiveness and swore he would find a way to protect the family, though they both knew he was just a construction worker with a bad back and $300 in the bank. At 3 in the afternoon, Margaret made a decision that would define the rest of her life, and then 12 others. She sent Tommy to collect their sons with instructions to tell them only that the family needed to have an urgent meeting. While he was gone, she went to the bedroom closet and moved aside winter coats to reveal a gun safe that Tommy had installed years earlier but rarely opened. Inside were his deer hunting rifle, a 12-gauge shotgun he'd inherited from his father, and a .38 revolver Margaret had bought for protection after a rash of break-ins in the neighborhood. Margaret had grown up with 4 brothers who taught her to shoot cans off fence posts behind their house. She understood weapons and respected them, but she had never imagined she would need to use one to protect her family. Now, as she checked the revolver's cylinder and confirmed it was loaded, she felt the same calm focus she remembered from those childhood afternoons with her brothers. When Tommy returned with Michael, Danny, and Patrick, Margaret sat them down in the living room and explained their situation with the same matter-of-fact tone she used to discuss household chores. The Cordova organization expected them to appear at a warehouse at midnight to be murdered because their father had made a terrible mistake. They could run, but men like Victor Cordova had long memories and longer reach. They could go to the police, but the Portland Police Bureau had been fighting corruption scandals for years, and everyone in the neighborhood knew certain officers received regular payments from the Cordova organization. Margaret's proposal was simple and direct. They would go to the warehouse as instructed, but they would go armed and ready to fight. They would arrive early, position themselves strategically, and when Cordova's people showed up expecting helpless victims, they would find the Bennett family ready for war. Michael, whose military training had taught him about ambushes and tactical positioning, immediately understood the logic of his mother's plan. Danny was terrified, but recognized they had no real alternatives. Patrick, the youngest, seemed almost excited by the prospect of violence, which worried Margaret, but didn't change her resolve. Tommy initially protested that they should run, disappear somewhere far from Portland, but Margaret reminded him that they had no money for such an escape and nowhere to go, that Cordova couldn't eventually find them. From 4 o'clock until sunset, the Bennett family prepared for what they all understood would likely be their last night alive. Margaret cooked a large dinner of pot roast and mashed potatoes, everyone's favorite meal, while the men cleaned weapons and discussed strategy. Michael drew diagrams of the warehouse layout from memory, having delivered construction supplies there 2 years earlier when he worked for a contractor. The warehouse sat on a dead-end street near the Willamette River, surrounded by vacant lots and abandoned buildings. It had been built in the 1940s to store lumber, but had been empty for years except for Cordova's occasional use as a meeting place for business that required privacy. The building was roughly rectangular, with large sliding doors on the street side and smaller entrance doors on the north and south walls. Michael remembered that the interior was mostly open space, with some small offices along the western wall and a series of shipping bays that hadn't been used in decades. As they ate what they all suspected might be their last meal together, Margaret looked around the table at her husband and sons and felt a fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. Tommy had betrayed their marriage, but he was still the father of her children. Michael had served his country and come home damaged but alive. Danny was gentle and hard-working, the son who brought her flowers on Mother's Day and called every time he worked late so she wouldn't worry. Patrick was wild and sometimes reckless, but he had his grandfather's hands and could fix anything mechanical. At 9:30, they loaded into Tommy's pickup truck and Margaret's station wagon, weapons hidden under blankets and in gym bags. The drive to the warehouse took 18 minutes through empty streets wet with February rain. Margaret drove behind Tommy, watching his truck's taillights and thinking about the 25 years of marriage they were risking on this desperate gamble. They arrived at the warehouse district at 10:15 p.m., parking 2 blocks away and approaching on foot through the maze of abandoned buildings. Michael took point, moving with the careful precision the army had taught him, while Patrick covered their rear with the 12-gauge shotgun. Tommy carried his hunting rifle, and Danny had a pistol Margaret had borrowed from her brother Sean that afternoon. The warehouse loomed ahead of them in the darkness, its broken windows like dead eyes, watching their approach. Margaret felt her heart hammering in her chest, but forced herself to breathe steadily and focus on the plan they had discussed. They would position themselves in the shipping bays along the east wall, using the concrete barriers for cover. When Cordova's people arrived, they would have clear fields of fire toward both the main entrance and the smaller side doors. At 10:47 p.m., exactly 12 hours after Jesus Morales had delivered his ultimatum, the Bennett family took their positions inside the warehouse. The building smelled of motor oil and rust, with occasional sounds from rats moving through the debris scattered across the concrete floor. Margaret crouched behind a shipping barrier with her .38 revolver, the metal cold and heavy in her hands. To her left, Michael lay prone with the hunting rifle, its scope adjusted for the dim light filtering through the high windows. Danny and Patrick flanked them on either side, weapons ready, all of them waiting for what felt like hours, but was actually only 23 minutes. The first car arrived at 11:10 p.m., a black Cadillac that moved slowly down the dead-end street before stopping in front of the warehouse's main entrance. Margaret watched through a gap in the concrete as 3 men stepped out, their voices carrying clearly in the cold air. She recognized Jesus Morales by his distinctive laugh, the same sound she had heard in her living room that morning when he described what they planned to do to her family. Victor Cordova arrived 8 minutes later in a white Mercedes, accompanied by 2 more men, and followed by a van that disgorged 4 additional members of his organization. Margaret counted 11 people total as they gathered in front of the warehouse, their cigarettes glowing like fireflies in the darkness. She could hear Cordova's voice, speaking rapid Spanish that she couldn't understand, but whose tone conveyed authority and cold satisfaction. At 11:31 p.m., the warehouse doors slid open with a grinding sound that echoed through the empty building. Flashlight beams swept across the interior as Cordova's men entered, calling for the Bennett family to show themselves. Margaret pressed herself lower behind the concrete barrier and felt a strange calm settle over her, the same feeling she had experienced as a teenager when her brother taught her to shoot. The moment when everything else disappeared except the target and the trigger. Jesus Morales walked into the center of the warehouse, his voice echoing off the walls as he shouted threats and demands. He held a gasoline can in one hand and a pistol in the other, explaining in detail what would happen to each member of the Bennett family before they died. Behind him, Cordova's other men spread out through the building, their flashlights creating moving shadows that danced across the walls and ceiling. Margaret made eye contact with Michael and nodded slightly. Her eldest son adjusted his grip on the hunting rifle and settled the crosshairs on Jesus Morales's chest. The first shot came at 11:34 p.m., a sharp crack that seemed impossibly loud in the confined space. Morales spun and fell, the gasoline can clattering across the concrete as his body hit the floor. What followed was 17 minutes of absolute chaos. Cordova's men, caught completely off guard by the ambush, scattered toward cover that didn't exist, firing wildly at muzzle flashes and shadows. Margaret's family had the advantage of position and preparation, but they were outnumbered nearly 3-1 by men who killed for a living. Margaret's first shot took down Ramon Velasquez as he ran toward the south wall. Her second caught Hector Santos in the shoulder, spinning him around but not dropping him. The .38 revolver bucked in her hands with each shot, the sound mixing with the deeper boom of Patrick's shotgun and the precise crack of Michael's rifle. Tommy, positioned near the main entrance, found himself face to face with two of Cordova's men as they tried to retreat to their cars. His hunting rifle, designed for deer at 300 yards, was devastating at close range. His first shot nearly cut one man in half, while his second took the top off another man's head in a spray of blood and brain matter that would haunt Tommy's dreams for the rest of his life. Danny, crouched behind a concrete pillar, methodically worked through the clip in his borrowed pistol, each shot carefully aimed despite the adrenaline flooding his system. He had never fired a weapon in anger before, had never even been in a serious fist fight, but desperation gave him a steady hand and cold precision that surprised him. Michael, drawing on his military training, controlled his breathing and worked his rifle's bolt action with mechanical efficiency. Each shot was carefully placed, and each one found its target. He moved through Cordova's men like a professional, showing no emotion as bodies dropped around the warehouse floor. Patrick, at 17, the youngest and most reckless of the Bennett children, charged from cover with his shotgun, pumping shells into the chamber and firing as fast as he could work the action. His approach lacked tactical sophistication, but the 12-gauge was a devastating weapon at close range, and his aggressive assault scattered the remaining members of Cordova's organization. Victor Cordova himself died at 11:47 p.m., 13 minutes after the shooting started. He had taken cover behind his Mercedes, but made the mistake of trying to run for the van when he thought the Bennett family was distracted. Margaret saw him moving in her peripheral vision and turned to track him with her revolver. Her shot caught him in the back as he reached for the van's door handle, and he fell forward against the vehicle, sliding down to leave a streak of blood on the white paint. By 11:51 p.m., 12 men were dead, and the warehouse had fallen silent except for the sound of brass casings rolling across concrete and the Bennett family's heavy breathing. Margaret stood slowly, her legs shaking from adrenaline, and surveyed the carnage they had created. Bodies lay scattered throughout the building, some motionless, others making quiet sounds that gradually faded into silence. The family gathered in the center of the warehouse, all of them covered in gunpowder residue and splattered with blood that wasn't their own. Michael had taken a bullet through his left forearm, and Patrick had cuts on his face from concrete fragments, but otherwise they were uninjured. They stood among the bodies of Cordova's organization and realized that they had just declared war on one of Portland's most powerful criminal families. Margaret made the decision to burn the warehouse. They had eliminated Victor Cordova and most of his inner circle, but there would be others who would want revenge, and leaving evidence would only make them easier targets. Tommy retrieved the gasoline can that Jesus Morales had dropped, while Michael and Danny gathered additional accelerant from the vehicles outside. They soaked the bodies and scattered gasoline throughout the building, then retreated to their cars. The warehouse fire started at 12:23 a.m. on February 28, 1987, visible from miles away as orange flames reached toward the low clouds. By the time Portland Fire Bureau arrived, the building was fully involved, and the intense heat made rescue attempts impossible. The official investigation would conclude that the fire had started accidentally, possibly from illegal drug manufacturing, and that the 12 bodies found in the ruins had died from smoke inhalation before being burned beyond recognition. The Bennett family drove home in silence, their weapons cleaned and disposed of in the Willamette River during the 20-minute journey back to Southeast Morrison Street. They entered their house at 1:15 a.m., and Margaret immediately started coffee while Tommy called in sick to his construction job. Nobody slept that night. They sat around the kitchen table, drinking coffee and listening to sirens in the distance, waiting for police cars that never came. Over the following weeks, the Portland Police Bureau investigated the warehouse fire and the disappearance of Victor Cordova's organization, but they found no evidence connecting the Bennett family to either event. The few surviving members of Cordova's extended criminal network assumed their boss had been killed by rivals from Seattle or Los Angeles, and they focused their revenge efforts in those directions rather than considering the possibility that an ordinary Portland family had wiped out their entire leadership structure. The affair between Tommy and Sofia Cordova became irrelevant when Sofia herself disappeared 3 days after the warehouse fire. Some people said she had fled to Mexico to escape her husband's enemies. Others suggested she had been killed by the same people who murdered Victor. Margaret knew the truth. Sofia had been in the van when it burned, but she never shared this knowledge with anyone, including her own family. In the months following what Portland newspapers would call the Riverside Warehouse Massacre, the Bennett family struggled to return to normal life. Tommy quit drinking and started attending Mass regularly at St. Kevin Catholic Church, seeking forgiveness for sins that went far beyond adultery. Michael used his military benefits to enter Portland State University, majoring in criminal justice with a focus on psychology. Danny left his job at Safeway and opened a small auto repair shop with money he claimed came from an insurance settlement. Patrick finished high school and joined the Marines, seeking structure and discipline to channel the violence he had discovered within himself. Margaret continued cleaning houses for wealthy families in the West Hills, but she found herself watching their children with new appreciation for innocence and safety. She never spoke about what happened in the warehouse, not even to her priest during confession. Some sins, she believed, were too large for absolution, and some burdens were meant to be carried alone. The psychological impact of that night affected each family member differently. Tommy developed chronic insomnia and would often sit on the front porch until dawn, smoking cigarettes and watching the empty street. Michael threw himself into his studies, but began experiencing panic attacks during crowded social situations. Danny became obsessively organized in his work, arranging tools and parts with military precision, as if perfect order could somehow balance the chaos they had created. Patrick grew increasingly distant from his family, as if the violence they had shared was simultaneously the thing that bound them together and drove them apart. 5 years after the warehouse fire, federal investigators looking into drug trafficking along the West Coast opened a case file on the Cordova organization's sudden disappearance. DEA agents interviewed dozens of people who had known Victor Cordova, but the trail had grown cold. The official conclusion was that Cordova had been killed by competitors, possibly from Mexican cartels expanding their operations into the Pacific Northwest. Margaret's marriage to Tommy survived, but it was transformed by guilt and shared secrets. They developed a formal politeness that replaced their earlier intimacy, speaking to each other like business partners, managing a household rather than lovers who had once shared everything. The affair was never mentioned again, but its consequences had killed 12 people and changed their family forever. By 1995, 8 years after the warehouse massacre, the Bennett family had scattered across the country. Michael graduated from Portland State with honors and joined the FBI, specializing in organized crime investigations. His colleagues never suspected that his expertise in criminal psychology came from intimate personal experience with violence and its aftermath. Danny's auto repair business expanded into a chain of shops throughout Oregon. His success built on a work ethic, driven by the need to stay busy and avoid thinking about the past. Patrick served 2 tours with the Marines in the Gulf War, where his comfort with violence made him an effective soldier, but also earned him a reputation for excessive aggression. He left the military in 1994 with an honorable discharge and a collection of commendations that didn't mention the disciplinary actions taken for his inability to distinguish between necessary force and unnecessary brutality. Tommy developed emphysema from years of construction work and chain smoking, but he lived long enough to walk Danny down the aisle in 1998 when his middle son married a nurse from Emmanuel Hospital. Margaret wore a blue dress to the wedding and smiled for photographs, but those who knew her well noticed that her eyes never seemed to focus on anything close by, as if she was always looking towards some distant point beyond the present moment. The neighborhood around Southeast Morrison Street changed dramatically during the 1990s. Young professionals discovered the area's affordable housing and proximity to downtown Portland, driving up property values and displacing working-class families who had lived there for generations. The Bennett house was sold in 1999 for 3 times what Tommy had paid for it in 1969, but Margaret felt no satisfaction in the profit. Money couldn't purchase absolution or erase memories. In 2003, 16 years after the warehouse fire, Margaret was diagnosed with breast cancer. During her treatment at Oregon Health and Science University, she met other women facing mortality and heard their stories of regret and redemption. She began to understand that carrying guilt alone for so many years had been another form of violence, this one directed at herself and her family. Margaret died on February 27, 2004, exactly 17 years and 1 day before the anniversary of the warehouse massacre. Her death certificate listed cancer as the cause, but her sons knew she had simply grown tired of carrying secrets. At her funeral, Father Mackenzie from St. Kevin's spoke about forgiveness and the possibility of peace, even for those who believed themselves beyond redemption. Tommy followed his wife 6 months later, dying in his sleep from heart failure. The official cause was cardiovascular disease, complicated by emphysema, but his sons believed he had died of loneliness and guilt. They buried him next to Margaret in Mount Calvary Cemetery, under a simple granite headstone that listed only their names and dates, offering no summary of lives that had been defined by a single night of violence. Michael retired from the FBI in 2010 after a distinguished career that included helping to dismantle several major criminal organizations. His expertise in understanding criminal psychology had made him one of the Bureau's most effective investigators, though he never worked cases involving organized crime in Oregon. He settled in Virginia with his wife and 2 children, neither of whom knew their grandfather had been an adulterer or their grandmother had been a killer. Danny sold his auto repair business in 2008 and moved to Arizona, seeking distance from Portland and its memories. He became a part-time community college instructor, teaching automotive technology to young men who reminded him of his younger self before the night that changed everything. He never married, telling friends that he preferred independence, but the truth was that he had never learned to trust anyone completely after discovering that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary violence. Patrick's path was the most troubled of the 3 brothers. He struggled with alcohol and anger management throughout his 30s and 40s, unable to find civilian employment that satisfied someone who had learned to solve problems with overwhelming force. He worked construction like his father, but was fired repeatedly for fights with co-workers and supervisors. In 2012, he was arrested for assault after beating a man unconscious outside a bar in northeast Portland. During his sentencing hearing, he told the judge that he had been trying for 25 years to find a way to be peaceful, but peace felt like betrayal of something essential within himself. The last surviving witness to the warehouse massacre died in 2019 when Patrick Bennett suffered a heart attack while working on a motorcycle in his garage in Bend, Oregon. He was 52 years old and had never married or had children. His neighbors described him as a quiet man who kept to himself but would help with repairs or emergency mechanical problems without asking for payment. Today, the site of the former warehouse on Southeast McLaughlin Boulevard is occupied by a Starbucks and a small strip mall featuring a tax preparation service, a nail salon, and a shop that sells electronic cigarettes. Few people in the area remember the fire that destroyed the previous building, and none suspect that 12 people died violently on that spot during a February night in 1987. The Cordova organization's criminal enterprises were eventually absorbed by other groups or simply disappeared as the drug trade evolved and new players entered the Portland market. Law enforcement agencies continue to investigate unsolved cases from that era, but the warehouse massacre has never been officially connected to any suspects. The case remains open in Portland Police Bureau files, but it is not actively investigated. Federal authorities estimate that Victor Cordova's organization was responsible for importing several tons of cocaine into the Pacific Northwest between 1982 and 1987, generating millions of dollars in profits that were never recovered. The money presumably remains in bank accounts or investments controlled by people who are now dead or who have chosen to remain silent about their knowledge of Cordova's business activities. The Bennett family's story illustrates how a single act of infidelity can create consequences that echo through generations. Tommy's affair with Sofia Cordova lasted 6 months, but its aftermath shaped his family's life for decades. His wife became a killer, his sons became men, defined by shared violence, and their neighborhood lost a family that had been part of its fabric for nearly 20 years. Perhaps most significantly, the warehouse massacre demonstrates how ordinary people can commit extraordinary violence when they believe they have no alternatives. Margaret Bennett was a house cleaner who attended Mass every Sunday and had never committed a crime more serious than jaywalking. Yet when her family was threatened, she planned and executed an ambush that eliminated an entire criminal organization with ruthless efficiency. The psychological transformation required for such violence comes with permanent costs. None of the Bennett family members ever fully recovered from what they did that February night. They survived physically, but the people who entered the warehouse at 10:15 p.m. were not the same people who left at 12:23 a.m. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and they spent the rest of their lives learning to live with what they had become. This story raises uncomfortable questions about justice, survival, and the capacity for violence that exists within seemingly peaceful communities. The Cordova organization was eliminated not by law enforcement or rival criminals, but by a working-class family who refused to become victims. Whether their actions constituted self-defense or vigilante justice depends on perspectives that are shaped by personal experience with violence and desperation. In the end, the warehouse massacre solved one problem by creating others that lasted decades. The Bennett family escaped immediate death but entered a kind of living prison constructed from guilt and shared secrets. They won their war against the Cordova organization, but lost their peace, their innocence, and ultimately their ability to remain together as a family. The empty lot, where the Bennett house once stood on Southeast Morrison Street, is now occupied by a modern duplex that sells for more money than Tommy earned in 5 years of construction work. The new residents are young professionals who work in Portland's technology sector, people whose biggest concerns involve student loan payments and career advancement rather than criminal organizations and life or death decisions. They have no knowledge of the family who once lived on their property, no understanding of the violence that was planned in their kitchen and the weapons that were cleaned in their basement. The past has been erased by gentrification and time, leaving only this story as evidence that ordinary people sometimes do extraordinary things when survival requires them to abandon everything they once believed about themselves and the world they inhabit.